Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual event, Benefits of the District of Columbia's Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund for Workforce Wellbeing and Retention. For the next hour, we are excited to share with you information about this landmark initiative and new research evidence describing the early implementation of DC's Pay Equity Fund. Before I get started, I have a few housekeeping items. First, please note this event will be recorded. The recording will be available on the Urban Institute website event page. So if you missed something or want to share with a colleague later, you will have access to a full recording. Speaker biographies and the slide deck are also available online. We will drop a link in the chat to those resources if you'd like to check them out. And during today's presentation, you can show or hide captions or adjust settings with the captions button at the bottom of your screen. All participants will be muted during the event, but we would love to hear from you. If you have a question or a comment, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box at any time. We will monitor those questions and be sure to save time at the end to discuss. Also, we'd love to get your feedback on today's event, so please take a minute at the end to complete a brief survey and tell us what you think. And during the event, you can engage with us online using hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Next, I'll take a moment to introduce today's speakers. My name is Heather Sandstrom, and I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and the principal investigator for the District of Columbia Child Care Policy Research Partnership. I will be the moderator for today's panel. The first panelist will be Sarah Mead, Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning at the District of Columbia Office of the State Superintendent of Education, or OSSE. Sarah will describe the history, structure, and mechanics of the Pay Equity Fund and how the district was able to make this happen. Then we'll hear from 3 members of the Urban Institute research team that is examining the implementation of the Pay Equity Fund in partnership with OSSE. Erica Greenberg is a senior fellow in Urban Institute's Education Data and Policy Center and co-principal investigator for the District of Columbia Child Care Policy Research Partnership. And she will describe the study goals, research questions, and methods. Then we will turn to Justin Dormal, a senior research associate in Urban Institute's Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population, and a task leader for our study. And we'll hear from Laura Jimenez Para, a research associate also in Urban Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population. And together, Justin and Laura will describe some of the key findings from our implementation study to date. So with that, Sarah, I will now turn it over to you. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I just want to express OSSE's gratitude to Urban for this research partnership. I'm going to be sharing today about a very exciting initiative we're implementing in the district that is one of the first in the nation to do what we are doing. And so we are so grateful to have a strong research partnership to support us in learning from this opportunity. Before we get started, though, I want to give a little bit of context about the role of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in the district's vision for early learning. We recognize that high quality early educators are probably the most important strategy that we have in order to advance our goals for access quality of childcare in the District of Columbia, given the research showing the strong link between the quality of interactions and relationships between adults in early learning settings and young children's development. There are 3 components to our strategy for advancing a high quality early learning workforce. First, we set high standards. We do that through our licensing regulations that since 2016 have required lead teachers and expanded home caregivers to hold an associate's degree in early childhood education or related field, and all adults working as teacher assistants, home providers, associate home caregivers to hold at least a child development associate, which is the entry-level credential for early educators. Those requirements went fully into effect this past December at the same time as we made changes in order to increase the flexibility in how early educators can meet and on what timeline they can meet them while maintaining that high standard. The second prong in our strategy is supporting early childhood educators to meet those high standards, which we do through investments in scholarships, child development associate credential programs, and extensive professional development and early childhood mental health consultation supports for our early childhood educators. But the third prong, which is just as important as the first two, is to compensate early childhood educators commensurate with those high standards that we set. And that is really where the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund comes in that we'll be talking about today. So where did this fund come from and what is it? The district has a long history of leadership in early childhood education. And for about 15 years, we have been the only jurisdiction in the country to have universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. As that universal pre-K program came into being and grew, it became clear that we also needed significant efforts focused on infants and toddlers and the care settings that care for them and provide early education for them for two reasons. First, as schools were serving more 3 and 4-year-olds, that was impacting our early childhood development facilities that had historically served children birth through 5. And also, as we saw the benefits of pre-K for our 3 and 4-year-olds, it also became increasingly clear that 3 is too late to start. Children are learning even before birth, but definitely from birth on. And in order to achieve our goals for advancing education for all children, we needed to focus on infant and toddlers as well. So in 2018, the district passed legislation called the Birth to 3 Act that laid out a very expansive vision for supporting infant and toddler care comparable to our universal pre-K program. That included investments in expanding access to childcare subsidies, increasing compensation for the early childhood educator workforce, and raising the subsidy rates that OSSI pays for low-income families to attend childcare facilities. However, that legislation was never fully funded. Then in 2021, as part of the district's 2022 budget, the council passed legislation that increased tax revenues for the district and allocated those tax revenues for 3 activities, one of which was specifically increasing pay for early childhood educators. However, at the time that happened, the council was not entirely sure what the best way to increase pay for early childhood educators was. So they did something really smart, which was to create a task force composed of stakeholders and experts from the district's early learning sector, as well as some national experts, to provide a venue for really working through what the best way to increase compensation for early childhood educators in the district with these funds would be. And that task force met from October 2021 through April of 2022 and recommended what is essentially a 2-part strategy. Over the long term, the task force recognized that to sustainably increase pay for early childhood educators, we need to increase the revenues that are flowing to our child development facilities so that they can raise the base wages and salaries they pay to their staff. However, the task force also recognized that it would take time to set up a system to do that, and so recommended also that in the short term, for the first 2 years, 2022 and 2023, OSSI implement a program of direct supplemental payments to early childhood educators working through an intermediary with expertise in cash distribution. And you can see here a link to the full task force report, which goes into great detail about how we are approaching this. But if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about those supplemental payments, which, since that's the piece of the work we've done so far, is the piece that Urban's research we'll talk about today focuses on. So in fiscal year 2022 and 23, OSSI partnered with an organization called Aid Kit to disperse supplemental payments directly to early childhood educators. And we chose Aid Kit, which was an organization that emerged during the COVID pandemic to support secure, high integrity distribution of cash transfer payments to a wide range of folks during the pandemic. Because of their experience working with populations similar to the district's early childhood educator population, including undocumented and unbanked populations, as well as early childhood educators in some other states, as well as the ease of use of their system, its ability to support access in multiple languages, and their track record of partnering with local entities to really maximize uptake of programs they administered. And we've had a very good experience partnering with them to distribute these funds. If we move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the results to date. So in fiscal year 2022, OSSI distributed a little over $38 million in payments to 3,217 early childhood educators, and this is a very high percentage of the eligible early childhood educators in the district. We had a very high saturation point for reaching folks with this program. And then in FY23, in the first 3 quarters, we distributed over $41 million to over 4,000 early childhood educators. And I will note that because of transitions in the workforce, that number is larger than the number at any one point in time. So some early childhood educators may have been working in the field. We distributed payments 4 times a year for 1 quarter and then not for another quarter. And then somebody else might come in. So that is part of the reason why a number of early childhood educators receiving payments increased so much from 22 to 23. And if we can move on to the next slide. So now we are in fiscal year 24 for the district, and we have stopped making the direct payments through AidKit and are now have transitioned to distributing funds to our early childhood development facilities in order to increase compensation for their employees who are eligible early childhood educators. I'll talk a little bit more about what this looks like in the later part of the presentation today. But essentially what happens is that historically, our early childhood facilities have had 2 revenue sources: tuition paid by parents and our child care subsidy program. What the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 24 does is essentially add a new revenue stream on top of tuition and childcare subsidies to assist our programs in getting to a level of revenue that enables them to pay early childhood educators higher salaries commensurate with educators in our public schools. In exchange for receiving that fund, our child development facilities must commit to meet certain minimum salaries by role and credential. That's the program as we've rolled it out starting this year. However, today, most of the conversation is going to focus on what we did the first 2 years where we distributed direct payments. And on that note, I will turn it over to Erica Greenberg to share Urban's research.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you go on to the next slide, you can see that Heather, Sarah, and I are part of a much larger project partnership team. Justin Dorimal and Laura Jimenez-Parra will present shortly. Catherine Kagera and Hannah Matthews are collaborators at the DC Office of the State Superintendent of Education. And Victoria Nelson, Eve Mefford, Ellie Nicolopoulos, and Rachel Lamb are expert contributors at Urban. This work has been made possible by grants from the Administration for Children and Families of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So, how did we set out to study the benefits and challenges of DC's Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund? With a conceptual framework, of course. Very briefly, our Pay Equity Fund study examines how increased compensation relates to professional and personal well-being, which in turn may relate to job attachment and retention. This conceptual framework guides study design, methods, and analytic approaches, along with a dissemination strategy. We also clarified a set of study goals. Applying an implementation science approach, we set out to understand for whom and under what conditions wage supplements do or do not work well and why. First, we aim to document the mission, goals, and early implementation of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We've done so in a case study published in June of last year, fact sheets published earlier this week, and more reporting to come. Second, we sought to raise up the experiences of early educators eligible for and receiving Pay Equity Fund payments. To achieve this goal, we designed and conducted primary data collection centering the experiences of early educators to supplement available administrative data. Third, we plan to disseminate findings to DC and national audiences so that people with power have the information they need in the format and on the timeline they need it to improve policy and implementation and ultimately improve the well-being of early educators, children, and families. Thank you for sharing this goal with us today. Here are guiding research questions. What benefits and challenges do wage supplements offer early educators, particularly regarding well-being? What benefits and challenges do wage supplements offer childcare employers, particularly regarding staff recruitment and retention? And finally, for whom and under what conditions are the wage supplements successful in meeting desired equity, well-being, and retention goals? To answer these pressing questions and capture the implementation of innovative policy in real time, our study design is iterative, equity-centered, and mixed methods, as well as community and policy engaged. The study and our presentation today have leveraged data from multiple sources. We launched the project with key informant interviews in winter of 2022 and spring 23, before fielding surveys of early educators, home providers, and center directors in spring and summer of 23. We followed up with select survey participants by holding early educator focus groups in fall of 2023. Data analysis of Pay Equity Fund administrative records is ongoing, and our surveys will repeat this spring and summer and next. Today, we'll focus on the perspectives and experiences that early educators and directors had with the first 3 Pay Equity Fund payments, the FY22 lump sum and first 2 quarterly payments of FY23, with much more to come in the future. Now I'll pass to Laura and Justin to delve into the methods and findings.
Thank you, Erica. And so our findings will focus on the surveys and focus groups conducted between spring and fall 23, as Erica noted, and just to iterate again, the point that during this period, some educators may have been receiving their 3rd quarterly payment, but we're really focusing on those first 2 quarterly payments as well as the lump sum. And so if you hear us saying things like any of the 3 payments, all 3 payments, it's really just those first 2 quarterly payments and then the lump sum the year prior in 2022. Next slide. So I'll focus first to describe our data sources. I'll focus first on the educator and home provider survey on the left. We designed our surveys with the goal of hearing from every early educator who was eligible for the Pay Equity Fund, regardless of teaching role or the childcare setting they were employed at. This was possible through the administrative data that we receive as part of our partnership with OSSI. The survey itself asked educators on a range of their experiences, both specific to the Pay Equity Fund and more broadly about being a childcare educator in DC. Ultimately, we heard from about 42% of educators who were eligible for any of the 3 Pay Equity Fund payments. Directing your attention to the right of the screen for a moment, you'll notice we conducted focus groups to focus on follow up on perspectives shared from the survey. Earlier study publications had captured experiences of center directors and home-based providers. And so these focus groups and the insights that we gained from them today, when we talk about, will focus on early educators who are working in DC child development centers. We conducted 12 focus groups in all, 4 in Spanish, 8 in English, and in all heard from 19 lead teachers and 11 assistant teachers. Finally, we also wanted to hear from directors and owners of child development centers that were employing educators eligible for Pay Equity Fund payments. We heard from 137 directors who oversaw 157 facilities for about a 50% response rate. And you'll notice across all the study activities, we offered gift cards to participants that compensated them for participation in the study commensurate with the time we asked of them. Next slide, please. On this slide, we describe the demographics of early educators who are represented in our data. You'll note that the median salary reported that among early educators was about $35,000 per year, with lead teachers making slightly more than assistant teachers. For context, during this period, full-time lead teachers could receive $14,000 through the Pay Equity Fund, which is about 37% of the wages reported here, and full-time assistant teachers could receive $10,000, which was about 31% of the median wages reported here as well. Although these wages are slightly more than what childcare workers nationally would make, relative to other occupations in DC, it is far lower, with the 2022 median wage in DC being nearly $75,000 for all workers with earnings. The low levels of compensation are disconcerting, given that the childcare workforce, both nationally and in DC, are predominantly women and specifically women of color. And so you'll note in our survey sample, just 10% of educators who responded to the survey identify as white. And in the data, as well as DC nationally, more than 95% are women. On most observable characteristics, the participants who are in our study resemble the population of all eligible educators who could receive payments through the Pay Equity Fund. Where we do observe any differences, we're able to correct for those when we present survey findings using analytic survey weights that we developed through the administrative data that we received through our data sharing agreement. Next slide.
Great. So moving to the findings from our analysis of the survey and focus group, we'll begin discussing the experiences of early educators accessing these payments. I'll walk through when participants first heard about it, the application process, as well as the receipt of these funds. So during our focus group with educators, we asked them to reflect about their initial impressions of the Pay Equity Fund when they first learned about it. We found that the majority of educators expressed skepticism and disbelief that the Pay Equity Fund was real at first. Several felt that they had to confirm with their colleagues and bosses to make sure they weren't going to be somehow scammed, as it was a significant shift in the field that they had never seen before in their profession. However, amidst this initial doubt, educators emphasized that there was also an underlying excitement at the opportunity of better pay, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Alongside with these emotions, some educators expressed initial confusion about the Pay Equity Fund with varying levels of understanding in its implementation, eligibility criteria, and just the overall process. When seeking information about the Pay Equity Fund, early educators turned to their colleagues and center directors as trusted sources of information, and peer recommendations and insights from those within their immediate professional circle played a crucial role in shaping their understanding of the Pay Equity Fund. In fact, educators who received guidance and support from their center directors in OSSI reported having a smoother understanding of the Pay Equity Fund, underscoring the importance of accessible resources and clear communication channels and initiatives like these. Participants also highlighted the value of workshops, trainings, or meetings where the details of the Pay Equity Fund were explained to them, noting that these helped in clearing up any initial confusion and fostering really a deeper understanding of the program. Sorry. As expressed in the words of this assistant teacher with 30 years of experience, the excitement yet slight skepticism surrounding the Pay Equity Fund was unmistakable, sharing how everyone in their center was just buzzing about it. We can also see the important role her center director and training sessions played in solidifying the belief that the Pay Equity Fund was not just a rumor, but a tangible reality. This account and the insights into the initial impressions of early educators showcase effective communication and the power of engagement strategies and generating enthusiasm and buying for initiatives like the Pay Equity Fund. Ultimately, when it came to actually applying for and receiving payments from the Pay Equity Fund, most early educators reported having positive experiences. As Sarah highlighted in an earlier slide, the majority of early educators that were eligible for the Pay Equity Fund applied to receive these payments. And based on our survey, we find that more than 85% of educators thought that the process for applying and receiving the funds was either easy or very easy. And in fact, just 4% of educators said that the process was either difficult or very difficult. This is an encouraging finding, as the last thing you would want from a wage supplement program is even more barriers to giving early educators the dollars that they deserve. Our qualitative data provides a more nuanced understanding of the experiences encountered by educators during this crucial phase. Focus groups reveal that when what went particularly well and what was particularly challenging for early educators when applying for and receiving the Pay Equity Fund, as well as what helped during this process. So when looking at our analysis of the focus group, several educators found valuable support in navigating the application process through the assistance provided by our local childcare resource and referral agency staff and their own employers. This guidance proved instrumental in helping them maneuver through the necessary steps that the application process required. Yet it's important to acknowledge that the application process wasn't without its challenges. Technical glitches led to delays for some participants, adding a layer of frustration to the process. And challenges with interface, technology, incorrect data entry, and communication delays were some of the problems that were reported by educators. Additionally, frustrations also arose from mixed tax guidance and conflicted messages related to taxes. Some educators indicated that they and/or their colleagues did not initially understand that they would owe taxes on these payments and that these taxes were not going to be taken out from the beginning. Others did know that they would later owe taxes on the payment, but they weren't sure how much they would owe, and they were concerned that paying them back all at once would be a heavy burden for them. Several educators also personally felt and voiced that these payments should have not been taxed at all. And finally, while public benefit cliffs were initially a concern for some participants and could have been a problem, interagency agreements were established, providing exceptions for DC residents and alleviating these concerns. However, not all issues are easily addressable. In particular, directors continue to express their concerns about not being considered for eligibility and the potential wage compression. This issue emerged because not all staff positions were eligible for payments from the Pay Equity Fund. And indeed, in the absence of being eligible for the payments, 25% of directors in their survey reported that most teachers at their center earned more than they do as a result of the Pay Equity Fund. And similarly, 31% of directors agreed or strongly agreed that they considered changing their role so that they could be eligible for the payments. The quote on the right from a center director in their sample captures this concern. They mentioned how the Pay Equity Fund has significantly compressed wages for administrators, believing that unless the fund starts to include administrators and directors, it'll be difficult for centers to retain and equitably pay center directors. As the Pay Equity Fund progresses towards full implementation, it'll be important to continue monitoring staff eligibility concerns and to consider strategies for mitigating these and other unintended consequences that could otherwise obstruct larger workforce goals. But what do these payments mean to the early educators that did receive the payments from the Pay Equity Fund, and how do they utilize these payments? The Pay Equity Fund is a promising start toward alleviating the financial strains constantly reported among early educators. Our survey revealed that the supplemental payments played a crucial role in meeting educators' basic needs. But 95 to 96% of respondents reported that paying for housing, utilities, bills, foods, and groceries was easier with the payments they received from the Pay Equity Fund. Furthermore, these payments also contributed to the recipient's financial well-being, allowing them to pay off debts, cover emergency needs, and build savings. This really underscores the importance of greater and more equitable compensation in addressing the pervasive financial insecurity experienced by early educators. This reflection from a lead teacher in a focus group really accentuates the critical role that the Pay Equity Fund has played in alleviating these financial concerns. As we see here, this quote exemplifies how these funds were a lifeline for navigating the challenges brought about by the pandemic and the increasing costs of daily life, as the payments helped this participant cover their expenses that they were concerned about on a monthly basis. And when discussing the perceived benefits of the Pay Equity Fund in focus groups, educators highlighted several key aspects. Across the board, educators conveyed this sincere appreciation and just overwhelming gratitude for the Pay Equity Fund. The majority of early educators emphasized the critical role the Pay Equity Fund played in providing much needed financial relief and stability. Similar to our survey findings, participants in the focus groups shared how the funds helped them pay for their bills and debts that they had accumulated, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And furthermore, many educators noted that the fund has made early educators in general feel truly appreciated and acknowledged for the vital role that they play in shaping young minds, elevating their sense of professionalism, garnering increased respect, and providing recognition for their contributions, both within the community and amongst colleagues. Importantly, educators noted how the fund significantly reduced their anxiety and stress associated with the financial struggles and the stressful nature of their profession. Additionally, the fund also acted as a motivational force, inspiring a few educators to pursue further education and professional growth. Educators noted that the funds contributed to their career advancement by helping with education-related expenses, enabling them to pursue higher education and just support their career goals overall. The impact of the Pay Equity Fund is exemplified through this quote from an assistant teacher with 20 years of experience. This participant in this quote speaks to the often overlooked role of educators, highlighting how they feel the Pay Equity Fund has shifted the narrative, making them noticeable. No longer seen as mere babysitters, but now recognized as teachers, elevating their sense of professionalism and really getting the respect that they've worked so hard and so long for. And now I'll turn it to Justin, who will discuss the Pay Equity Fund and early childhood education workforce goals.
Thank you. So early educators and directors we heard from commented not only on what the payments meant to them personally, as Laura has showed us, but also how it could better the childcare facility and the field at large. As Erica mentioned, we began the study by talking to a number of key informants to learn about the Pay Equity Fund. And one of the things we asked them was what they viewed as goals, what were the goals of the Pay Equity Fund? In particular, three things emerged from their comments. One was this idea of achieving pay parity would be an important step towards redressing structural racism that has created disparities between childcare and public schools. Second, the idea that increasing wages could help recruit and retain childcare workers, perhaps even increasing educators' sense of respect, and professionalism to the field. And finally, that wage supplements could improve care quality, perhaps through relieving early childhood educators' financial pressures to allow them to focus on work in the classroom, or perhaps through attracting high-quality educators to the field. And so for the remainder of the presentation, we're going to talk about findings that start to touch on each of these points, acknowledging that as the Pay Equity Fund progresses and as our research continues, it will be important to return to these and other points to ensure that Pay Equity Fund is meeting its intended goals. First, on the point of pay parity and equity. So on the survey, we asked educators whether they agreed with the statement. Because of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund payment, I feel like I'm being paid what I should be for the credentials required for my job. And showing just this first top bar for now, you can see at the far right that 29% agreed with the statement a lot, an additional 41% said they agreed with it somewhat. In contrast, only 13% said not at all. To unpack that a little bit, in focus groups and in open-ended survey questions, a few educators did express several ways that the payments, in their view, were not yet meeting pay equity goals. Some educators shared that the Pay Equity Fund payments were not enough and not equitable, given that the educational requirements and demands of the job. Others voiced that recognition and payment amounts should also be based on more things like experience and not solely on the position or even their degree that they held. We did look to see if the responses to this survey question differed by their credentials, and in general, we're not seeing too many differences. It's worth noting that the findings, when we asked this question, supplemental payments were occurring when educators were already dissatisfied with low levels of compensation. And so in our survey, we did find that 35% of early educators reported being dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with their pay outside of the wage supplements, even though when we asked them about satisfaction with their job overall, only 8% indicated that they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. So in all, we're seeing that although the agreement was not necessarily widespread, in general, many did view the Pay Equity Fund as helping to close the gap towards fair compensation. And as I mentioned before, it'll be important to continue tracking early educators' view on fair and equitable pay as the Pay Equity Fund progresses in the years to come. Next, on the topic of recruitment and retention, the Pay Equity Fund appears to shape not only educators' views of their job as it is now, but also on their perspectives on the future. In our data, 70% of educators report being very or extremely likely to remain at the current job in the next 2 years. Moreover, when asked about their own plans to stay in DC childcare, 62%, so the black and the pink bars combined, either agreed or strongly agree with the statement that they plan to continue working in DC childcare longer than they otherwise would have as a result of the Pay Equity Fund payments. It's to note, the finding is similar when we asked educators about their plans to stay at their current facility as opposed to DC childcare at large. And although we don't show it here, we do also want to make the point that educators who held more positive views of fair pay, if you recall the graph from the slide before, were also more likely to indicate that they plan to stay in DC childcare longer. In this slide, we show the responses to the same survey item, but now we break it out by the facility types that educators were employed in. And so you can see is that educators in home-based settings, the bottom two bars, are just slightly more likely to agree that the Pay Equity Fund extended their plans to stay in DC childcare, but really across the board, regardless of setting, what we're seeing is that there's overall agreement to that statement. This infant toddler assistant teacher, who has been in the field for more than 20 years, offers one example of the ideas from the previous slide, tying the payments and how they are improving the current situation to supporting their aspirations to continue working in the field. And so I think it really brings to life some of what we were seeing in the survey data. Directors and educators also talked about ideas of hiring and retention in childcare beyond just their own plans and aspirations. And so, for example, directors talked about hiring and retention specifically. 59% said that the Pay Equity Fund payments were impacting new teachers' decisions to start working at their facility. And even more, 70% of them were saying that they were impacting decisions to stay at the facility. And so therefore sort of early signs that could be promoting work stability in childcare sites in the workforce. But more than just sort of keeping teachers in general, the directors were also seeing that the payments were helping them keep their best teachers. And we'll return to that point in a few slides when we talk about care quality, but it's really more than just keeping teachers in general, but really toward the goal of improving the quality of childcare being offered in the district. In focus groups, educators also talked about how the Pay Equity Fund could be a significant factor in retaining and recruiting educators. They often reference low salaries as a possible contributor to high turnover rates among their colleagues in the field at large. In our survey, we found when we asked educators sort of if they had sort of considered looking for a job or had actually done so, 1/3 had done that. And when we asked for primary reasons that they considered it, wanting higher pay was actually among the top, reported by 74% of people who had engaged in job-seeking behavior. As I mentioned at the top, low wages in childcare are pervasive beyond the district's border. It's an issue that is also true nationally. And in fact, several educators in our data did mention knowing colleagues who had moved from Virginia and Maryland childcare into the district because of more appealing compensation made possible through the Pay Equity Fund. This quote from an infant toddler teacher captures many of the sentiments that I just described. The idea that when educators are paid more, especially relative to other jobs they could be pursuing that offer similar compensation, and in some cases, potentially fewer day-to-day demands, as a result, childcare facilities are likely to have an easier time finding and keeping their teachers. And so I think, given the early stages of the Pay Equity Fund and that it's continuing to progress, more time and more data will be needed to carefully answer the question of whether the Pay Equity Fund is promoting retention in the long term. But I think these survey responses and focus group insights from both educators and directors offer a promising sign for potential positive impact, at least for now. Finally, we would be remiss to not touch on the implications of the Pay Equity Fund on the quality of care provided, as many of us, educators, administrators, researchers, and changemakers alike, are all in this field and are here today, in part because of the impact we want to have for kids. One way we look at this is through a survey item in which we ask educators whether they agree with the statement, because of the Pay Equity Fund payments, I can better focus on the needs and developments of children I work with. And you can see here, showing you just one bar for now, the majority of early educators expressed agreement with this statement. Indeed, 71% of educators indicated agreeing at least either somewhat or a lot, which is that the sum of the black and gray bars. And I'm going to talk about that statistic on the next slide. And so keep in mind the gray and black bars. What we thought was really interesting as well is when we looked at this with regard to their views on fair pay from the beginning. And again, just looking at how much those black and gray bars differ across their responses to that first question. For example, if you look at the educators who don't believe that at all that they're being paid what they should, 37% sort of agreed to this question, which is still a lot, mind you, but less than 71%. But where you look at the top, the bar that says a lot, that number is now at 89% of educators. And so we see this as a promising early sign that pay parity initiatives can be one potential pathway towards fostering care quality across childcare settings. And I do want to note that in the upcoming months, we're eager to complement these survey findings with analysis of observations of program quality conducted by the district through Capital Quality. And those ratings will be coming out this spring. And so for the first time since the pandemic, we'll be able to conduct analyses that compare classroom observations like environmental rating scale, classroom assessment scoring system measures, both before and after Pay Equity Fund rollback. And so stay tuned for those findings. In focus groups, early educators expressed a number of ways in which the Pay Equity Fund was potentially contributing to program quality increases. Some educators highlighted that the Pay Equity Fund had motivated them to pursue higher education and training and was giving them the financial resources to begin doing so and to sort of equip themselves with more professional skills. Educators could then apply these skills and practices in their classroom, which then could contribute to better quality overall. A few educators did mention finances, but talked about how the payments were allowing them to focus more on the profession by relieving them of financial stressors that otherwise bog them in the classroom day after day. About half of the educators in focus groups discussed how a living wage improved their perspectives about their job, which in turn they felt resulted in increased job satisfaction and better performance on the job, which would thereby have a positive effect on children and the centers as a whole. Finally, both educators in these focus groups, as well as center directors in their surveys, mentioned how a better recognized and compensated workforce could attract new qualified educators into the field who may have just not thought of the opportunity due to unappealing wages or other reasons. I think this quote from an infant toddler to lead teacher encapsulate all of the ideas across the last slides in sort of one nice reflection. They talk about how they're able to come to work free from many of the financial pressures that otherwise come with underpaid work. They tie these feelings with their practice and hope for a positive difference on their kids in the center. And one line in particular, I think really puts it all together. My classroom is going to prosper more because I am prospering more. So in a moment, I'll turn it over back to Sarah to reflect on these findings and discuss the future of the Pay Equity Fund. But I do want to end on this slide to really emphasize the gratitude and enthusiasm expressed across DC childcare for just the existence of this Pay Equity Fund, as well as its hope for continuation. Quotes from standard directors, lead teachers, really convey unpromptedly their appreciation, right? The Pay Equity Fund's an incredible concept. It might transform childcare. It's been a lifeline. It's an amazing opportunity. And so they're really eager to see where this is headed and hope for its future. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk more about Pay Equity Fund moving forward.
Thank you so much, Justin. And again, so grateful to have this opportunity to reflect on the impacts that we're seeing from the fund to date. I want to talk a little bit about the way the fund is being implemented this year, just as context, because it does respond to some of the feedback that we received, but it looks different. So this year in FY24, as I mentioned, we have transitioned from distributing payments directly to early childhood educators to instead distribute funding via a formula to child development facilities, who then, if they receive those funds, are required to pay at least a certain minimum salary to their eligible early childhood educator staff based on both role and credentials. So in this chart, you can see in the two farthest right columns the minimum salaries that are required for early childhood educators covered by the fund based on role, assistant teacher or lead teacher. And in the way assistant teacher and lead teacher are defined in the legislation, those categories do include home and expanded home caregivers are paid as lead teachers, and assistant teachers. That also applies to associate home caregivers, which would be a second or a third individual in a home setting. The minimum salaries are provided in both annual and hourly, because we know that many staff in the field are paid on an hourly basis. And again, in contrast to the first 2 years of the fund, where there was a flat amount based on role, starting this year, the employers are required to pay salaries that are differentiated based on role and credentials. In the middle column, you see what is called wage supplement. This is related to the funding formula that we use to calculate how much each child development facility receives through the fund. So the child development facilities receive funding based on the number of staff they have by role and credentials. And these are the numbers that are used as inputs for the funding formula. They do not indicate the amount the facility should be providing to the early childhood educator. That is based on the minimum salary requirements in the right-hand columns. If you can move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the funding formula itself. So those wage supplements that you saw in the last column are calculated for the number of staff a facility has who qualify to calculate a base award amount. That base award amount then is enhanced with a 15% administrative enhancement that is provided in recognition that facilities incur additional costs related to increased compensation, such as increased payroll taxes, workers' compensation, paid leave in the district, and so forth. We then also include something called the equity adjustment. This was required from the legislation that created the Pay Equity Fund and the recommendations of the task force that adjusts a facility's funding amount upwards if they are serving children participating in the district's child care subsidy program, up to a 60% increase, in recognition that programs that are serving more low-income children have less access to resources. We use child care subsidy percentage of children enrolled as a proxy variable for the level of economic disadvantage of the population that a facility serves, because that's data that we have. But we are engaging with stakeholders to look at whether there are ways that we could better implement the equity adjustment. And then finally, in fiscal year 24, we added 30% on top of those awards after inputting all those other formula variables, in order to recognize that there are increased costs that facilities face during this transition period when we're implementing the program for the first time. We will be, in concert with stakeholders, reviewing the funding formula this fiscal year to make updates for future fiscal years, but this is the funding formula in use for fiscal year 2024. If we can move on to the next slide, I want to briefly mention our Healthcare for Childcare program. We know that compensation is not just about salary, but also about benefits. And one concern that came up as we started implementing the program was whether some early childhood educators might lose access to certain benefits, particularly Medicaid, as a result of increased compensation. And so to address that concern and also address benefits parity, we partnered with the district's health benefits exchange to implement an innovative program known as Healthcare for Childcare, in which OSSI transfers funds to the exchange to help subsidize the cost of premiums for both childcare employers that qualify to participate in the exchange, as well as individual district residents who are employed in childcare. Individual district residents and their families can receive essentially $0 premium healthcare coverage through the exchange as a result of this. And those who are not district residents, if their employer participates in healthcare for childcare, receive either a free or subsidized premium depending on the choices their employer makes. And we are essentially subsidizing the premiums that the employers pay to reduce the cost for their employees. As a result of this, about 1,500 early childhood educators and their families or dependents are receiving healthcare coverage either through the individual or the employer-based market. And about 40% of those who are receiving these benefits did not previously have access to health insurance. Reducing the premiums really has helped bring more people into accessing health insurance coverage, which was our goal. And we are excited to continue implementing this program in concert with the Health Benefits Exchange. You can learn more about the program on our website. As I shared, we are now at a new stage of implementation that is the long-term implementation stage, and we are very excited to continue to partner with Urban to learn from this next stage in implementation as we move forward and continue to improve and refine the program. I'll turn it back over to the Urban team to share more about some of the related research.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Before we turn to question, I'd like to share this closing slide that includes our project landing page on Urban Institute's website. So just as a reminder, our Pay Equity Fund study is part of the larger DC Childcare Policy Research Partnership, and you can find all of our publications here on this landing page. You can either scan the QR code shown here now if you're interested in taking a look, or if you want to connect later, you can use the QR code or the hyperlink on the slide deck that will be posted online after the event. So with that, I will now turn to questions. So if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A box. We've been monitoring during the event, and there's a lot of great questions coming in. We will try to get through as many as we can, but we're also happy to follow up with you later if you're interested in more information. So please feel free to contact us, and we can get more information to answer your questions. So the first question is for you, Sarah, if you're ready. So I think there's a lot of interest in just how the district was able to make this happen, right? So I think one question we got was, how do you get legislators to understand the importance of funding early childhood education for the future of the state's growth and success? And is this policy sustainable?
Sure. So I can talk from the perspective of a state agency leader who's implementing the program, not necessarily an advocacy perspective, but I think one thing that's important to the overall history in the district across the whole history of our leadership in early childhood education is that we've made the most progress when there's been strong partnership between folks in my role who report through the administrative side of the executive, folks who are on the council, and folks who are in the advocacy space. And this is a great example of this, where the council moved forward legislation. It was supported by robust advocacy and was put on the table as a result of that robust advocacy. And then, my agency played a crucial role in shaping what that design of that looked like, and then also implementing it. And when you tie all those things together, you're most effectively able to both advance policy change and implement it effectively. We need things that can actually be implemented. I think the other piece that's very important in the district is that there was revenue tied to this program. So the biggest barrier to increasing compensation for early childhood educators is revenues. Child development facilities need more money in order to pay more, and those revenues need to come from somewhere. In this case, this legislation was made possible because it was accompanied by a tax increase that generated more revenue for the district, and some of that revenue was specifically used to justify this increase in compensation. And so I think those pieces are the most important piece, and that also ties to the sustainability. The sustainability comes from the fact that there was dedicated revenue from the program. Now, I will note that there are provisions in the legislation that require the minimum salaries for early childhood educators to be increased over time, either in tandem with the District of Columbia Public Schools salary schedule or aligned with the Consumer Price Index. And it is possible that those two factors will go up faster than the revenues that are coming to the district for this program. And that does create some sustainability cost pressures over time, as does the fact that we are seeing more of our early childhood educators earning credentials and making progress that enables them to earn higher compensation tied to credentials. So those things both create sustainability pressures. We are engaging with stakeholders to think through what are the best ways to navigate those sustainability pressures, and look forward to talking with you more about that after that stakeholder engagement process produces recommendations in the future.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And we'll probably come back to you in a moment, but I will next go to Erica. There's a question about our studying kind of the future of this work. So can you share a little bit more? Are there additional resources allocated for more data collection and analysis? What measures will be taken to assess the impact of the Pay Equity Fund? What are some challenges in assessing the impact?
That's a great question. Thank you. So as you all have seen today, our study applies an implementation science approach to explore the challenges and the benefits of pay equity. We've been able to assess the perceived impacts of the Pay Equity Fund on early educator well-being and workforce stability through key informant interviews, surveys, and focus groups, and we'll continue to uncover those impacts through ongoing surveys of educators and directors over the next few years. We're fortunate to have federal funding to cover that. We've also been working to analyze Pay Equity Fund payment data, and one advantage of having these sequential payments for fiscal year 22 and 23 is that we can see who was employed in childcare at each time point. From there, we can measure job and occupational turnover and compare the retention of staff who did and did not receive supplemental funds. We can also compare to benchmarks from other states. To assess the causal impacts of pay equity, the challenge lies in finding a counterfactual for DC's innovation, how DC early educators would have been doing in the absence of the wage supplements. Given the paucity of national data on the childcare workforce, the challenge of causal estimation here is a big one. To meet this challenge, Owen Chauchet of Mathematica has been using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and found that the first Pay Equity Fund payment increased DC's childcare workforce by about 100 educators, or 3%, at a time when many other states had stagnant or declining employment numbers. We're eager to continue building the evidence base on the various impacts of subsequent payments and on the new funding structure Sarah described.
Thank you so much, Erica. My next question is for Laura. So you spend many hours conducting focus groups with early educators. I know you heard many stories firsthand and just shared, some quotes in the presentation today, but I think everybody's just eager to learn more about sort of the impacts, if we can call it that, as people's stories about how these payments have really been helping them. And we got a question about, based on what you learned, what role does the Pay Equity Fund play in shaping societal attitudes toward early childhood education, and will it contribute to heightened awareness about educator financial well-being and potentially lead to a better investment in early childhood education and care? So any thoughts on that based on what you've heard directly?
Yeah, definitely. So the Pay Equity Fund is really a good start to changing the narrative and the attitudes towards the early childhood education workforce, and particularly childcare. So from what we heard in our focus groups, and as I mentioned in the presentation, the majority of educators felt that the Pay Equity Fund really significantly heightened their feelings of professionalism and respect and recognition amongst other early educators and within the community. And they felt specially recognized by the DC government. Similarly, the Pay Equity Fund was seen by educators as a long-awaited change and a step toward making childcare a more respected and attractive profession by several educators. However, some educators did also felt that there's still more to accomplish in terms of changing societal attitudes overall, particularly among parents who may have not known about this initiative and don't really know the intricacies of like what's going on with that. Being seen as babysitters instead of teachers is still a challenge that educators, we heard from them, face still in their profession. So there's still more work to be done, but the Pay Equity Fund is really a good step in the right direction.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I think if we can come back to you if you're there, I think there were lots of questions in the chat about eligibility, just trying to figure out, the difference between lead teachers, assistant teachers, and now with the new payment structure of programs opting in. I think there's just lots of questions about who's getting payments and sort of the process for determining eligibility. Did you want to share a little bit more about eligibility criteria? And I pointed people to some of the publications online, but if you wanted to just clarify a little bit for the audience.
Sure. So in our licensing system, we define specific roles for early childhood educators that are employed, excuse me, in centers and in child development homes. So every eligible early childhood educator must be employed in one of these staff types. And then the legislation further defines specific licensing roles. So essentially, there's a very specific definition of what the responsibilities and credential requirements for a teacher in a child development center, for an assistant teacher in a child development center, for a expanded home provider, and associate home caregiver are. So it's all tied to our licensing regulations.
Thank you. And while we still have you, I think there was another question about what are some initial successes, challenges, and impacts you're seeing from moving from the direct payments to individuals to the payments to facilities?
Yes, it is a big transition. And so I think one of the big challenges of the transition, but also the opportunity, is around needing to support the child development facilities in their own capacity to sort of understand what is the amount of funding that you are going to receive, how do you budget to support the minimum salaries, and what does that look like in terms of your overall financial sustainability. Our programs are in very different positions in terms of the support they need around that. I think the second piece is that because there are very specific sort of prescriptions tied to both the role that an individual is in and their credentials, we need to use the data that's in our licensing system related to roles and credentials, and we are sort of getting more in the weeds of the relationship between the employer and the employee than we historically have been in order to support this flow of funds through the employer to the employee. And that means that the information that's input in our licensing system, which is very important because it's needed for background checks, for supporting the health and safety of children, also then has money tied to it in ways that are new for our child development facilities. And so that has some changes in how they need to engage with the data and how we need to support them around it. And that, I think, for any other state or jurisdiction that is thinking about how you want to increase pay for early childhood educators, depending on how you are going about doing it, if you're trying to flow it through the employers to increase long-term compensation sustainably, it does mean, if you're doing that from a public perspective, that you are getting more into the depths of an employer-employee relationship in ways that are not typically the ways that the government programs engage. And there's a lot of untread territory that we need to work through in that area. And so we're learning a lot from it to improve the program as we move forward. However, it does address some of the issues that were raised in the research around withholding tax payments from folks. It is much better for the individual educators over time to receive funds through their normal paycheck because it's predictable, because the taxes are withheld, because people know up front what their compensation is. And so ideally long term, and it's the way most professionals are paid, that's where we want to go, but getting there is challenging because of the structure where this is a largely private and nonprofit employers, and we're trying to work through those employers to increase compensation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that's all the time we have for questions today, but we are checking the questions. I think some people are trying to type some answers before we close, and please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions and we can get back to you with answers. But I just want to thank all of our panelists today for the great presentation. Thank our audience for joining and listening and learning with us today. We will be sharing a recording of the event if you'd like to view again or share with others. And please take a moment to complete our exit event survey. Let us know what you liked. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you again for joining.